Okay, Mark chapter 14, beginning with verse 22, and we're going to go to the end of the chapter, verse 42. If you got your Bibles, I'd encourage you to open, or your electronic Bibles, and we're going to take a look at this passage this morning. We're also going to be turning to Hebrews 8 in just a little bit, but we'll start here. So again, Mark, as we've said many times, is a little bit of a cut and paste book, but not without purpose. It's not as though he took random acts and put them all together, glued it together, but rather he took various events, and the description of them tend to be very brief compared to some of the other Gospels. And so as we go through here, we're always asking ourselves, what's that common theme? What is it that he's trying to make sure that we understand with I say the little bit of narrative that he gives us, the little bit of detail, and how then does that tie to the other detail that he brings into his passages. So beginning with verse 22. So we're in the upper room now. That's where we left it the last time we were together, in the upper room. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it, and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And then, verse 26, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So I brought some pictures this morning. We're going to take a look at Jerusalem once again, try to get our bearings for where are we. Start with, nobody knows exactly where that upper room is. It's in the city of Jerusalem. That much is understood. But nobody knows exactly. Today, if you go to Jerusalem, you will have a place that is called the upper room. And it's a little bit of a tourist site. But not necessarily the upper room that Christ was in, but it's just a large open room in Jerusalem, and it's there to make sure that people get a feel for the size of those rooms and all of that. So anyway, I'm going to show you a little bit about where we might be in Jerusalem. So if you get your bearings here, of course, this is the Temple Mount, and that's the Dome of the Rock, and that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the other end of the Temple Mount. The Wailing Wall is this wall right here, that open space there, that courtyard. That is the west wall of the Temple Mount, and those blocks that are on that west wall are from the time of Christ. Everything else was torn down, and everything else was built up later. So, but that is where people go. The people of the Jewish faith go there to pray, and they'll stick little prayers into the wall and little piece of paper and so forth. So, the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, as it sometimes is referred to, is right there. This, of course, is the old city of Jerusalem, and this little finger that comes out down here is the old city of Jerusalem. This would have been the city of Jerusalem at the time of King David. This little finger here, and it's got steep sides on both sides of it, so it's easy to defend. That was there until, of course, after the kings, after the Babylonian captivity, when they came back to rebuild the temple. The Kidron Valley runs up through here, and that is a valley. It's a little hard to see here. And then the Mount of Olives goes up over here on this side. But what I want to point out is this little spot right over here, and that is the Garden of Gethsemane. And I'll show you pictures here in a second, but it is full of olive trees even to this day, and the Garden of Olives. And so this is where Christ went. Now, assuming that he was here. Now this wall is not the wall of the time of Christ. This comes later. But so this would have been the wall of the time of Christ would have been smaller. It would have been a smaller city inside here. So assuming that the upper room is somewhere in the middle of Jerusalem, from here to the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane is about a mile. So, how long does it take you to walk a mile? 20 minutes? Something like that? at that kind of a pace. They would have had to have gone around the Temple Mount to get over to the Mount of Olives. There is a road that goes around the Temple Mount, comes up to the top of this Kidron Valley, and then circles back around and comes by the Mount of Olives. So that gives you just a little bit of a perspective. So they're about a mile. When they stand up, and after singing a hymn, they stand up and they walk. They walk about 20 minutes and get to the Garden of Gethsemane. Here's another picture, again looking down on the Temple Mount, looking across at this Garden of Gethsemane, which would have been over here. Of course, a church has been built here. A church has been built here. We always say wherever there's an opportunity, they're going to build a church and then take your offering as well. But so you can go into that church. I believe that's the Church of Nations, Church of All Nations, Church of Nations is what this church is here. At any rate, just another perspective of the old city. This is what is now the Garden of Gethsemane. Of course, it wasn't quite as manicured at that time of Christ, but old olive trees. As a matter of fact, they believe that this particular olive tree was alive at the time of Christ. Kind of a scraggly looking thing. We'd probably cut it down over here, but it's very, very old. And so you can go over there and you can walk through the gardens as they're manicured today, but that just gives you a little bit of a perspective now as to where we are in geography in the city of Jerusalem. Okay, let's go back to our passage here. In addition to the death of Christ, what other themes do you see? What other theme do you see Mark emphasizing in verses 17 through 24? So just glance through here. 22 through 25, he is, of course, this is the Lord's Supper. He's instituting the Lord's Supper. 26 through 31, he's turning to Peter. And Peter's saying, first of all, he is saying in verse 27, you will all fall away. And then Peter says, not me. And then he says, oh yeah, before tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. Then they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And he says 3 times to his disciples, sit here and pray. And 3 times they go to sleep. And then he is in anguish, obviously, and finally at the end, he says, verse 42, rise, let us be going, see my betrayer is at hand. What theme do you see going through there? Ken?
Abandonment and betrayal.
Abandonment and betrayal in various and multi forms, right? That's what you see. Betrayal. Betrayal. I mean, he is predicting it. They are acting it out. They are trying to fight it. They're denying it. And that's the theme that is going through here. Abandonment and betrayal. So verses 18 through 21 predicts the betrayal. Right ahead of this passage, 18 through 21, the prediction of the betrayal by Judas. Then verse 27, he predicts that all will fall away. Yes?
13.
I'm in 14.
Can't be.
I think you're in 13. No. Make sure you're in Mark.
Mark?
Mark, not Matthew.
I hope I'm in.
My bad.
Okay? All right, good. All right, we're back. Okay, so verse 30 predicts Peter's denial. 37, they were asleep. Verse 40, they were asleep. Verse 41, they were asleep. Why so much emphasis on the weakness of man? The need for a Savior. Okay?
It's a stark contrast to Christ's commitment.
Okay? Stark contrast to Christ's commitment. Okay? Ken?
Man's inability to do what's right at the time, even with the leadership of Jesus in his presence.
Okay. Man's inability to do what is right, even with Christ standing right in front of him.
Standing out to me is the intention and the reality.
Ah.
How much our intention is for something to happen.
Yeah.
And the reality is
Yeah.
something different.
Yeah, the intention versus the reality. So Peter, not me. I'll never deny you. We know what happened 3 times. Yeah? Later on he says the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Yeah? Sharon?
Well, I'm wondering if they didn't comprehend yet that he's going to die. And so if they really believed that and really understood that, they would have been wide awake. They would have stayed awake.
Yeah.
Hours and hours. And I think that they still didn't really get it.
Did they understand that he was going to die? Did they really understand that? Had they understood that, would they have stayed awake? No, no. It was the middle of the night. What are you going to do? You're going to sleep, right? Yeah, we're going to get back to this theme, but I think it's important to see that that's the theme that's flowing through here, is really the weakness of man, and the betrayal, and the abandonment, and Christ at his greatest hour of need, he was asking for support from the disciples, and even asking for support, they fall asleep. Okay. Now, verse 24 refers to a covenant, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the new covenant, but that is what is being referred to here. And if you go over to Luke 22, you'll find a little bit more of a description as to this is the new covenant, and the description, a little more description of the covenant. But it is the institution of a new covenant that he is talking about here, with his blood and his body and his death and all of this that is about to happen, making reference to, clearly his death. I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. He is going somewhere and won't be having another meal with the disciples after this one. And so the covenant. So what's our understanding, and what do these verses, just looking at this right here, what do these verses teach us about the covenant that he makes at this time? Just these verses. Sheila? It's new. Things are going to be different than what they have been, okay?
He says, my blood of the covenant. So
Okay.
it's his doing.
Okay? His blood. His sacrifice. Okay?
In Greek it says, my blood is being poured out for you.
Poured out for you. Right. Yeah. And what would that have triggered in their mind? Covenant, start with the word covenant. What would have been their understanding of the covenant? And there were several covenants. There are several covenants through the Old Testament. But the big one involving sacrifice, of course, was the Mosaic covenant, which was conditional. It was a conditional covenant. It was a if, then I will. If you do this, if you keep my law, then I will respond in this way. If you don't keep my law, then I will respond in this way. And this covenant, though, and this is where I'd like us to turn to Hebrews chapter 8 and take a look at this passage, because it explains it much better than this very brief reference here in Mark 14. But yeah, Ken?
I just wanted to quickly go to the Greek word diakathe for covenant also means how in my death how things will be disposed of.
Okay, so again referencing his death, a covenant means when I am gone, this is my will. This is my testament. Yep. Okay, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 1. Well, right ahead of that, and if you were here a few weeks ago, I spoke about this passage in the Sunday morning service about Melchizedek, and he is a priest of that order, which means there is a different covenant. There is a different covenant being instituted, a different priesthood, and then the Aaronic from Aaron priesthood. So he's a priest of Melchizedek. And so then verse 1 of chapter 8, now the point is what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law, the old covenant. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. So the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Mosaic covenant was based on sacrifice. And it was the blood of animals. It was the blood of sheep. It was the blood of goats. It was the blood of bulls. It was blood everywhere. And it was a sacrificial covenant. So Christ, I should say God the Father, required blood. He required death. He required a sacrifice. He required a penalty for the sins. And in this particular case, it was animals. But the animal's sacrifice is not perfect. It could not accomplish what Christ could accomplish in his death. So when he turns and says, "This is my covenant," he is saying, this is the institution of something very new. This is not simply another sacrifice of the old covenant. This is a sacrifice that will initiate a new covenant. And then in Hebrews, he says, "For he finds fault with them." In other words, that old covenant has fault. When he finds fault with them, when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. A little bit of a challenge here, because the new covenant was actually handed, or I should say prophesied, to be applied to the nation of Israel. But he's referencing here in Hebrews, as well as when he speaks to his disciple, he's referencing a new covenant that is being offered to us. It is being offered to us, a new covenant. Something that will abolish the old, no more sacrifices necessary, the main point being that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was sufficient. It is the sacrifice that stops all other sacrifices. There is no more need for any other sacrifice, because Christ was the perfect sacrifice that satisfied the wrath and the requirements of God the Father. So a new covenant now has been instituted. Not a conditional covenant as the old covenant was, but an unconditional covenant. I am going to do these things, and my blood and my body is going to be that sacrifice that will institute the new covenant. That is profound, not my words. Him instituting a new covenant and abolishing the old covenant is history-shaping, ground-shaking. The earth moved when that happened. It is huge. Ken?
Just contemplate how interesting it is that the Jews that today have abandoned also that old covenant of sacrifice.
Well, some would like to start it again, but yes, they're no longer offering those sacrifices at this time. So the old covenant was a copy. It was a shadow. It was simply a reflection of the reality, and now here we have the reality. This is the covenant. As I say, we're not going to be able to get deep into the new covenant, but that's clearly what he's referencing here in his sacrifice instituting this new covenant. So then in verse 26 he goes on, and after they've sung a hymn, he goes and they go to the Mount of Olives. Verse 27, and Jesus said to them, You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. Peter said to him, Even though they all fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he said emphatically, If I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. Well-intentioned. Good intentions. Okay. Jesus states in verse 27, you will all fall away, referring to his disciples. With Christ knowing that they will all fall away, what does this teach us about Christ and about ourselves? Deb?
Not only did he know everything, but he loved us enough that he died for us anyway.
Okay. Okay. Knowing what we would do, knowing that they would fall away at this time.
Not only they, but all mankind.
Right.
He knew that.
Humanity, right? Would all, and he knew that. Still died. Saw another hand over here. Don?
Had the covenant not been unconditional, then we would not have salvation.
Okay.
I mean, there's faith. Faith alone in Christ alone is only possible because none of it depends on us.
Right.
And he knew we would fail.
Incapable. Humanity, incapable of fulfilling the law, of fulfilling his requirements, knowing we would all fail. Terry?
I was just thinking about the verse before when it said that, when Jesus said, I am establishing a new covenant with my blood. Only God could do that. You said how monumental that was.
Mhm.
God is the only one who can change those covenants. Man cannot create one that is lasting. And so I look at this and I'm thinking, he knows this because he's God and he knows the hearts of man.
Right.
That's reassuring to me. He knows us better than we know ourselves.
It is up to God. Only God can change the covenant. Only God can make the covenant. Only God can fulfill the covenant. And that should be reassuring to us. Yeah? Tip?
This may be an unpopular view of many leaders, but for him to accomplish his mission, he didn't need his disciples.
He didn't need his disciples.
For him to accomplish what he needed
Yeah.
to accomplish at that point did not
Right.
require their assistance.
Right.
Or was not dependent on how they acted.
Right. Did not require the disciples' assistance for him to accomplish what needed to be done.
Didn't depend upon that either.
What's that?
As Tim said, didn't depend on that.
Yeah, it didn't depend on them. Right.
So there's nothing that we can do today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, nothing that we can do today. What else? Terry?
You also see the pride of man, the pride. I'm going to do this. And
Yeah.
that independence
Yeah.
that we so cling to.
Right. The pride of man is so clear here, and that independence. Yeah. Yeah. You know, look at verse 30, excuse me. Not quite yet. Oh, we'll hold that for a second. Don't look at it quite that far ahead. Let's give you the answers. It's no good. Desires don't always lead to faithfulness. Good intentions don't always lead to faithfulness. Humility is how we approach God. God, this is my desire. I very much want to be obedient and faithful to you. But even, I hate using this question, but in this case I'm going to. They had to have been devastated when he turned to them and said, you're all going to fall away from me. That had to really bother them. It was heating up. He was talking about death. They're pitch dark in the garden. There are no streetlights. Pitch dark in the garden, in the middle of the night. And he is in deep anguish. You could have seen it on his face had you been able to see his face. He was in deep anguish. And then he is saying to them, you will all abandon me. Yeah.
I think you also see this humanity coming out because, it's like anyone would, you're my friend, will you hang in there with me on this? He goes and he weeps and he comes back and he's weeping blood, he's sweating blood, and he comes back and there's sleep. And he already knows the answer, they're going to fall away, and yet he, on the other hand, there's a conflict there going between his humanity, his own humanity, and yet he knows he has the power
You know, the thing that strikes me as as you were saying those things is that his faithfulness does not depend upon our faithfulness. And that is the message of the new covenant, is that it is him making a covenant and guaranteeing it with his sacrifice that this is what I am going to do, which is the only way it's going to work. Because the old covenant was not going to work. When it was instituted, God knew that it was not going to work. It was intended to drive people to dependency upon God, not to produce pride, but it did. And now he says, I'm going to do it once and for all. I'm going to create a new covenant, and my faithfulness will not depend upon your faithfulness. Ought to be our response. Thank you, Jesus, for doing that. Renee.
2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, he cannot deny himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he cannot deny himself. He's going to be faithful. Not dependent. He responds to our need, not to our faithfulness. And that's, of course, exactly what we need. So, Peter has said, absolutely not me, and they all said the same. And now he goes, and now they're in the garden. Probably as they're walking, he is talking about, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But now he's in the garden. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. Okay, stop there for a second. Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. Where did we last see them? Not last, but where he took his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John. How do we know that they were his closest disciples? What was the big event that they were allowed to see? Transfiguration. So they have seen Christ clearly manifested in all of his glory. And now they are being pulled in close in the middle of his struggle, and they fall asleep. They have seen the glory of God. They have seen him fully revealed as God. What is wrong with their faith? Of course, I'm not being serious with that question. We just have to look in the mirror, right? But I mean, here they've seen the transfiguration. They get pulled in close, and he brings them close to support him at this time, and they can't. They just can't. Jim?
He didn't bring them with him. Not only did he bring them with him, but he didn't bring them with him to pray with him.
Right. No, to pray. He went off on his own to pray. Right. But he pulled.
That's significant because he's in essence ignoring the humanity part of praying.
Right.
At that point, and he's going directly to the Father just by himself.
Right. So he expresses to them in this next verse, and he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. I mean, he is being very transparent. I am really struggling with what's about to happen. And so remain here and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? He picks out Simon, the one who said, oh, I'll never deny you. Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy. They did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. So 3 times. 3 times he came back to them. 3 times they were asleep. He asked, my soul is very sorrowful even to death. Remain here and watch. And they fell asleep. Okay. Verse 34, again in verse 38, Jesus encourages the disciples to watch and pray so that they will not fall into temptation. What particular temptations were they about to face, and how might prayer have changed the outcome? Excuse me.
I just think about how Peter cut that one soldier's ear off.
Yeah?
I mean, he was not ready for this. They were not ready for the.
Okay.
He said to watch out because they're coming after me. They weren't ready for that.
In the other gospel, Peter draws a sword and whacks the ear off of the servant, and they weren't ready. Is it in Mark? It comes up here? Okay.
So they weren't ready for that.
Weren't ready for that. Yeah? Don?
There's an application here that is not really part of the interpretation, but, you know, when a missionary team, like the Zambia team or any of our missionaries, request our prayer and we have full intention of praying faithfully and regularly for them, but how faith was hungry. And so many times when a person says to me, pray for me
Yeah.
about this,
Right.
and I want to stop right then and pray for them.
Right.
On the phone
Yeah.
or face to face or whatever, because I'm afraid I may blow it off and not get it done.
Yeah. Don was talking about when others ask for prayer. For them, you know, Don says, I'd like to do it right then because I'm just afraid I'll be like this and I'll just blow it off and not pray for them. So let's just stop here and pray, whether it's on the phone or whatever. Yeah. Ken?
Of course, the temptation became to deny him, to not follow him, and going when it got tough, they weren't ready.
Yeah, the temptation to flee, the temptation to deny him, the temptation, and then they weren't ready. They weren't ready, and they did scatter for a period of time, and they went and hid. Yeah? What was, yeah,
To me, falling asleep gives me a sign like they're confident. You're usually pretty comfortable if you're falling asleep. You don't have a lot of worries.
yeah.
So I think they didn't quite understand what was coming.
Clueless, right?
So they thought he kept saying, "Oh, you're going to deny me. You're going to deny me." And they're like, "No, I'm not. I'm good." And they would fall asleep.
Right.
They feel like they needed to pray about it. So it came back.
Right. They didn't understand what was coming. They didn't understand the intensity of what was about to happen. Yeah. And so they fell asleep. They were good with it all, right? Yeah. Yeah. Terry?
And I wonder if they figure, we saw him at the Transfiguration. He's got this covered. He doesn't need me. Somebody will come and help him.
He's God, right? I saw him at the Transfiguration. He's got it covered. He doesn't need me. What was Christ's temptation? Was he tempted? Do you see temptation here? And what was his temptation?
Not to do what he was asked to do.
Not to do the will of the Father, right? Not to do the will of the Father. And that was his prayer. So you go to the next question here, and what do we learn from Christ's prayer in verse 36? Verse 36, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. What do we learn from that prayer?
Willingness to submit to God's will, whatever it is.
Say that again.
A willingness to submit to God's will, whatever it is.
Okay, a willingness to submit to God's will, whatever it is. Larry?
I think the fact that Jesus prayed, even though he knew that God's will might, he was praying for God to change his will.
Okay.
I mean, and I guess that is something which, I mean, from a theological standpoint of God's sovereignty, to me, I don't think that means I look at that and say there's no limit on what we pray for.
Okay. He welcomes our prayers,
Even,
our expression of our desires.
even when we know he's asking us to do something that maybe we don't want to do. I mean, the specific application that came to me on this is, you get the person who's bitter towards God because of some tragedy in their life. And yet here you see God, even with Jesus, his own son, who's close to, despite Jesus' please don't make me go through this torture. God's plan is bigger than even to put his
Right, to put his son through that. God, get me out of this situation, get me out of this situation.
God's will
He didn't.
in our lives about suffering isn't about us.
Yeah.
It's about his overall plan.
Yeah, Terry.
That he called him Abba.
Yeah, start with that.
Yeah.
Started with that phrase, Abba, that endearing term to a father. Yeah.
We can do
In God, all things are possible with you. If you decide, you can do it. A clear expression of faith, right? All things are possible. Not all things he'll choose to do, but all things. Whatever he chooses to do, he's able to do it. Clear expression of faith. Starts with that endearing term, clear expression of faith, and then a clear expression of submission to the will of God. Clear expression of his willingness. Was Christ tempted to flee? Tempted to flee. You know, I mean, I mean, in all ways tempted as we are, yet without sin. Would you have been tempted to flee? You knew what was coming. You knew you could slip away in the dark. You knew you could live another day. I think he was tempted to flee. Deb?
He had to have been tempted to fear too, because even though he knew God was in control, he knew he was going to suffer.
Yeah. Oh.
That had to,
Oh, he knew what the death was going to be.
he knew how bad it would be.
Sure. Sure. Ken?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing as Deb, that suffering is the key here, and we've learned throughout history from Jesus' time to today.
Yeah.
That sometimes we must suffer in God's will.
We must, yeah, there are times when we must suffer. Now, so when he says to them, pray, that you don't give in to temptation, that you watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. It's going to get intense. It is going to get very hot. You are going to be tempted to deny, to flee, to run, to get away, whatever it may be, versus standing fast, versus submitting to the will of the Father. You are going to be tempted to get out of there, whatever that takes. And of course, we saw they did give in to temptation. They did flee. They did run. They did deny. They did all those things. And so could their prayers, had they watched and prayed, could that have changed the event in their life? That they would have stood fast? Perhaps. But I think that was the temptation he was talking about, because he was in anguish. Let this cup pass from me. How could you not have been tempted to get out of there? I mean, he knew they were coming. He could see the torches coming through. I mean, he knew how close he was. This was the time. And Judas was gone, and he wasn't there with them. And so where's Judas? Well, he'd gone out to betray him. And it was coming. And then that anticipation was building. And boy, that was an very intense moment.
Even though Jesus was going through all that, his thoughts were of us, because he wanted us to pray and be strong in the Lord.
Right.
His thoughts were of us.
They were. He was going to have to go through what he went through alone. Only Christ was going to be able to die. But he thought of them and said, this is your time as well to stand here. So what can we learn from this prayer in verse 36? I think you learn those three things. And one you see very clearly that God welcomes that relationship of an endearing relationship. When he calls out Abba, it's that endearing relationship. You are close in a personal relationship with the Father because of Christ. 2, a clear expression of faith. Whatever you choose to do, God, you're able to do it. And I'm about to express my desire to you. And then, of course, he submitted to the will, and he went to the cross. And that's that's what we wrestle with in this life, right? That is our application. That's what we wrestle with. We wrestle with it. Here are my desires. I very much desire to see my friend healed. You can do it if you choose to do it. No, you can. We've seen it happen. Please choose to do it, but not my will, but your will. That's our life. That's our pattern. That's our relationship as we walk here in this world.
I guess the question I have is looking at the different, there's a little bit different dynamic. In Jesus' prayer, he knows what's coming, where the disciples, he's telling them to pray because of, to be prepared. The risk of articulating this inarticulate about this, but isn't this another application is that prayer should be part of our preparation for, again, what life's coming. In other words, we don't, it's kind of like the difference between a foxhole prayer and
Right.
a prayer of preparation.
Right. So in the morning you get up and you pray and you prepare yourself for the day. Father, don't let me fall into temptation. That I might remain obedient, that I might remain steadfast, that I might do your will.
Help me to see whatever comes my way today. It's part of your will for my life and my opportunity to glorify you in my response.
Right. For what's to come, the unknown of what's to come. Yeah.
And just to still our hearts. The unexpected can come at any time with us.
Yeah. It could count.
And, how we handle that, how we respond to that to God's
and
God's ministry really kind of depends on how well we prepare our hearts.
How we have prepared ourselves for those moments. Yeah. Last question. What consolation and encouragement can you draw from the disciples' experience at Gethsemane? Yeah?
Even though they failed him, he does not fail them.
Okay? Even though they failed him, he did not fail them. Okay? Sharon?
And Jesus knew that they would fail him, and yet he still wanted them close.
Yeah. He knew that they would fail him, and he still wanted to spend time with them. He still wanted them close. Where did the disciples go after this? Well, we know where they went immediately. They went and hid. But where did the disciples go after this? You follow these disciples through the book of Acts, and you say, are these the guys asleep? These the same guys? So I say encouragement. There's hope for us. If these were the guys in the garden asleep, if these were the ones denying Christ, if these were the ones, I say, choosing to be disobedient, don't get hung up. Don't get high-centered. Don't get stuck on the past. Don't get stuck on those things where you have been unfaithful to God. This is big stuff. This is real unfaithfulness to God himself in the garden at this time. They fall asleep. They deny him. They hide. That's real unfaithfulness. That's real betrayal. But then look what happened. Look how God used them after that. So encouragement to us, right? That we don't dwell on our past and we don't just get stuck there and say, well, God could never use me. He used them. He can use us. We're all unfaithful at times. He can use us too.
Two things. One thing, God, the triune, Jesus was the same as God. He was the same hierarchy.
Yep.
Godhead, and yet Jesus, decided, and he still, in the end, had his own will available.
Yes.
And I think that's a key thing too. He literally set that will down and said, "Let your will take over."
Christ had a choice at that time, as we have choices. We have our will. Christ had his will, but he clearly set his will aside for the Father.
We're weak, which they were.
Yeah.
We are. God's still strong.
Yeah.
Jesus and
Yeah.
God still did the plan. They still did the work.
Yeah.
They were working while the others and humanity and everything
Yep.
was asleep.
Yeah. Yeah. God continued to work while the disciples sleep. Yeah. Well, there's so much in this passage, but we're gonna close here and let's close in prayer.